Welcome back, everyone. So let's talk about what it is that we need to do with this user object in a very narrow focused feature that we want to build. Let's say that inside of our navigation component, what we want to do is that when a user is signed in, instead of saying sign in for the link, we want to instead show a sign out link instead, so that when the user clicks it, we sign them out of their account. How do we do that? Well, in order to do that, we need to be able to register and figure out whether or not a user is currently signed in or not. And the way we do that is we know that we get back the appropriate user auth as a response whenever we sign in successfully or whenever a user signs up. So how do we store this inside of this context that I've talked about? So let me show you how it is to create a context in the first place. It's very similar to a component that wraps around all of your other components that need access to this context. Context you can kind of see as a storage place, except it's a component that exclusively stores things. So let's build something with context. Inside of your source folder, I like to make a separate folder for my contexts. So I'm going to say contexts like so. And inside, I want to make a user.context.jsx. Remember, it's .jsx because we are writing out a component. So in order to use context, we have to first create a context using the createContext method that we get from React. Then what we're going to do in order to create this context is first we need to actually export out the context itself. So you can see the context as being two pieces. One is the actual storage thing itself, and this is the literal context. So for us, because it's a user context, I'm going to call it user context. And this is equal to calling createContext, which will build out a context for us. And what we want to pass to it is the default value. Not necessarily the initial value, but kind of like the default value. We'll talk more about this. So actually, before we even start filling it out, let's just discuss the other pieces of it. So this I want you to see as the actual value you want to access. And then there is also going to be a provider. So we want to export both of these, both the context and the provider. So a provider is the actual component. So this user provider is going to be this literal functional component. And what we do is we receive children. And what we need to do is we need to return user context dot provider. So on every context that gets built for us, there is a dot provider. And the dot provider is the component that will wrap around any other components that need access to the values inside. In here, we are just going to render the children. So essentially what happens is that, let's say you have app, for example, app being our app component. We're going to wrap this in the user provider component. And then inside of app of course will now be the children. So we want to take this children and then put it around our user context provider. This is really just some kind of alias component that allows us to use this user context.provider and wrap the children. So what else do we need to pass to this provider? Well, this provider is where it's going to receive the value, which is going to hold the actual contextual values. So this is where it might get a little confusing, but follow along with me now. What we know is that we want to store a user object, so current user, for example. And what we can do, because it's a component, is leverage all of our hooks that allow us to store things. So we want to store a user state. Let's just use the use state hook. And here I'm going to say that current user gets both the actual value, but also the setter function. And I want to be able to initialize this value as null. Next, what I want to do is I want to actually generate the value that I'm going to pass in here. So this is going to be an object that passes the two values that are important, which is both the current user as well as the set current user. So both the setter function and the actual value. So what you can think about with this provider is that this provider is essentially allowing any of its child components to access the values inside of its use state. So we're just doing use state as we normally do. We have a value for that use state and we have the setter for that use state. But I want to be able to call this setter and get the value anywhere inside of the component tree that is nested within this actual provider value. So then all we do is we pass this value into here. And now we go back to this context. And remember, we're trying to instantiate the initial point of this. So I know that this value you can see as if, well, you're like Yihua, didn't we pass an initial null value into current user? We did. But this is for the state. This is not necessarily for the context. The context needs an initial value as well. And we just want to build the base empty state of what this is. So current user being a actual object, usually the empty state of an object should be null because you want a null check to define whether or not you have a user existing object or no object. An empty object is still going to evaluate as true. So we know that there's no context when the current user value is null. And then what's the default value of a setter function? Well, this is actually just a function that does nothing. So it's an empty function that returns null. It's the most basic type of blank function you can think of. But this is all we need. Essentially what's happening is we are going to create this user provider and we want to wrap it around the portion of our code that matters. So I'm going to go into index.js and I'm going to wrap the entire app component inside of this. So let's just first shuffle these around so that they're in the right order. And we're going to import in our user provider from our contexts folder. So context, user context. And then all we need to do is wrap our app inside of our user provider. So now any component inside of this user provider nested deep within the app can access the context value inside of the provider itself. So the user provider is solely meant to tell us, oh, inside of my component tree, which components have access to my context. It's going to be any components inside of the provider. Anything outside will not be able to access the context. So here inside of app, we know that we want our sign-in form to be able to access this context because whenever the user signs in, we want to actually take this user object and we want to store it inside the context. So to do this, we need to use two things. First, we need to use the use context hook, and then we need to bring in the actual context itself. So we're going to go into our context folder and we're going to import in the user context object. This user context object is going to give us back whatever value is passed in for the value. And our value is the current user of use state as well as the setter function. So this value we've instantiated as an object, so we'll get this exact object back with whatever the current user value inside of the user provider's use state is currently set at. So here, in order to utilize this, what we need to do is come down here and we'll say const is equal to use context, passing in the user context. So as we know, we get back an object, and for our sign-in form, we just want to set the value. So I'm going to say set current user, and I'm going to run set current user whenever this user value comes back. Then what I want to do is that I want to access it inside of my navigation component. So in my navigation component, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to import in the use context from React, and then I'm going to import in the user context value from the context user context. But this time, what I want from the user context is the current user value, not the setter. So I'm going to call use context on the user context the same way that we saw when we were pulling the setter function inside of our sign-in form. But this time, I want the actual value of current user. So now if I console log current user and I save this and I go back to my application here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in and sign in. So as we know, what should happen is that our sign-in form signs in, gets the response, destructures the user, stores it into our context. But then what should happen is that it should log from our navigation component. So here, what's happening? Why is it that this component ran? Remember, the fact that we logged it means that our functional component was re-rendered. The reason why is because useContext as a hook tells this component, oh, whenever a value inside of this context updates, re-render me. So what's happening here is that because we're leveraging this current user value, we are saying, oh, I want you to run my functional component again and re-render me because this value inside of the user context has updated. And the reason why this triggers is because of useState being called with the setter function. So as we remember, a component re-renders whenever its state updates or whenever its props changes. Here, you can imagine that this useState value setter function was called. This current user value updates. That means that any component that is listening for current user should in turn update, meaning that it should re-render, which our current user does. Because if the current user value updates, we most likely will want to update our JSX because there's a chance we're using it as part of our UI. So this is how context works. It seems complicated, but really all it is that this context is just a glorified component that is really just leveraging useState. And all we're doing is exposing the value as well as the setter of this useState value externally. Whatever values that you want a component to be able to expose, you can also expose through a context, which we will see later throughout the course. But really, this is all that's happening here, is that we created some parent level component at the very top of our app that gives us access to some component inside's useState value. Then inside of our respective places, we're either getting and using the setter, or we're getting and using the actual value. This is useContext. So in the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of the nuances with useContext in our model of understanding re-renders with components. So I'll see you in the next video.